Welcome back to our third installment in teaching the Spanish colonial and Mexican national period webinar series extraordinaire. Um, in many ways, this is kind of the culmination of the 3 days because we're talking about all these great connections, right? That span all these different units that we teach in the beginning of the year. And oftentimes the Mexican national period and the Texas Revolution, like those get in some ways the lion's share of attention. And that's fabulous and wonderful. But as we've been talking about on Tuesday and we talked about yesterday, and we're gonna continue with today, the fun thing about that is that those are in many ways the culmination of so many processes that have been going on, in many cases, for hundreds of years within the situation within Texas. And so what Courtney and I want to do, besides go over, some of what happened and give you guys some really great content pieces along the way that you can take into your classroom, a la the magic of what Courtney has done so beautifully, is try to tie those threads together with you guys and show us and that when we get to the Mexican national period is the culmination of so many things that we've been talking about up until this point. All right. Quick reminder before I get going on the first section here is that, as Liz said, you guys were fabulous and have been for the last 2 days in the chat. Love seeing you guys active in there. It is so much fun. It is so interactive. Please keep that up. Whenever questions you guys have along the way, I'll be able to dive into those while Courtney's talking. Vice versa, when I pick up the mic again, Courtney's going to dive in there and she'll answer any questions, thoughts, suggestions you guys need about stuff. Use us as resources. That's why we're here, to help you guys and to try to give you guys as much as we possibly can. And you guys get a lot from each other in the process. So please, please, please keep that going. Okay. So with no further ado, I'm going to dive into the making of Mexican Texas and pick up where we left off last time, which was the collapse of the Spanish position within Texas, which, as we talked about, was a long time coming because of a lot of decisions that the Spanish Empire had made when it was trying to conquer is probably too strong a word, but control Texas, right? And they tried to control Texas, as we said, for a very long time through the mission system. That never works because the Indians never want to become Spaniards, right? When the Comanches enter Texas in the 1730s, they, instead of the Spanish, become the dominant force in Texas. And again, I think that's just a really powerful illustration of how weak the Spanish are this entire period, is that it is the Comanches who are in fact the ones who are calling the shots for the most part, right? So that by the time we get to 1800, as we talked about yesterday, there's really only 3 campsites the Spaniards have in Texas: Nacogdoches, San Antonio, and La Bahia, and they're barely holding on by their fingernails in 1800. And then things get worse and go downhill from there. So the Spanish position becomes even weaker. Part of it's because the United States moves even closer with the Louisiana Purchase. A lot of it's because of the violence of the Mexican Revolution that cuts the Texas population, or the population of Spaniards in Texas, basically in half, and allows the increase both of raids amongst Comanches and Apaches and the invasion of people like James Long, some Americans who come across the border, that by this point, by 1819, 1820, 1821, Spain just has no control of this region. They just don't. They're losing it and they know it. And it's about to fall to pieces, which is why, and you have to understand all of that background. You really do, to understand why the Spanish then say, you know what? What if we invite in the Americans, right? When I took seventh grade Texas history, a very long time ago now, we basically started the story with Stephen F. Austin, and it always felt weird to me that he shows up and the Spanish go, "Sure, we'll just bring in the Americans," but they don't, right? They invite in Stephen F. Austin, as we said last time, because it's the least bad option available to them, and they're looking for anything that could possibly happen that could help shore up Spanish control of Texas. But the Spanish don't get to see if that works because they lose the Mexican War for Independence just as soon as Stephen F. Austin is coming into Texas in 1821, the summer of 1821. Austin enters Texas in July. He gets to San Antonio in August. When he gets there, news has arrived that Mexico has become independent, right? And so we enter this new period. which is where Mexico is picking up the pieces. This is what we talked about last time of what Spain had left them, and they turned to the Americans. They turned to Stephen F. Austin specifically to start a colony. All right, so we're going to start with that colony. And essential question one, you can see it's going to guide this first section is the Americans who are coming in. Why are there so many Americans eager to leave the United States for Stephen F. Austin's colony and to leave the United States and move to Mexico? Why? Why are they doing this? Why is that appealing to them? Right? These are really important questions for us to ask and to have our students think about, right? And I always say that the place to start here is that, again, what happens with Austin coming into Texas and the Americans who follow him is not coming out of a vacuum. It doesn't just happen out of nothing. It's a continuation of processes that have been happening, in this case, in the United States. So last time we talked about this movement of people to Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, this more than 1/3 of a million people who've moved there, right? The vast majority of those people have moved there in the last 5 years, between 1815 and 1820, as a part of the Cotton Revolution, right? This massive explosion in cotton cultivation that's being driven by cotton prices going through the roof. I mean, it'd be like today, oil prices hitting like $400 a barrel. Like it was the most valuable commodity in the world. So people moved to Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana to grow cotton. The white people in moving there are bringing enslaved people with them to grow that cotton. And 40% of all the people who are moving are being brought as enslaved laborers. And so you have this massive movement moving south and west in the southern United States. You can see all these arrows. I showed you guys this map yesterday. They're moving toward the US Texas border, right? This whole process has been moving this direction, right? Austin is an extension of that. So this is the crucial context I want you to understand for Austin's colony is that Austin isn't just going into Mexico out of nothing. He's a part of this cotton frontier moving westward. And so he's just taking what's been happening already, going to Mississippi and Alabama and extending it. But now it's going to go over the Sabine River. It's leaving US borders and going into now Mexico. That is the context in which Austin comes into Texas. And when he does, he's doing it with the support of the Tejanos, the native, they were Spaniards, now they're Mexicans, but the natives, Spaniards, now Mexicans who live in Texas, like Jose Antonio Navarro over here on the left, bottom left, right? He's doing it with their support, all right? Because they want the economic development cotton can produce. They want the transformations that will bring, the positive ones they hope. And they've also given up on any hope that Mexico City is going to do anything to help them whatsoever. All right. So and this is something else I always emphasize when I tell my students about this. Because when I was in 7th grade, we just heard about Austin and his brilliant idea, and he went into Texas, and it was amazing, super duper. But it's not just Austin doing this. It's the Austin and the Tejanos working together. Austin could not do this without Tejano support. All right. Especially when he gets to Texas and realizes that Mexico is now independent, because that happens while Austin's on his way. And Austin's contract is with the Spanish, not with Mexico. And so Austin's going to need the Tejano support in order to set up his colony, right? And the Tejanos say, don't worry that this is now a new country, Mexico. We're going to support you. You just go out, find the right land, and start setting up your colony, all right? So Austin does. In the fall of 1821, he goes out surveying where he's going to put his colony, right? And this is a good exercise with students, right? You see right here, this is a slide I actually show in my class when I teach the Texas Survey, UNT. Where would you put the colony if you were Stephen F. Austin, right? And I have my students go through the mental process of thinking like, what's the good geography? What are they looking for? What are the places that would be more appealing than others? And this is a great tie-in to what we talked about on Tuesday, right? Geography matters, right? It's going to matter in a different way now to Austin's colonists than it did to the Carancos or the Caddos or the Apaches or whichever group we're talking about here. But once again, it's the geography and what the land can do and the resources it makes available that is going to shape how people move and make their lives in this Texas region. And in this case, what Austin's looking for, he's looking for good cotton land. He's looking for land that's a lot like Mississippi or Alabama, rich soils, good irrigation, river systems that are good for water, but river systems that are very good for shipments, right? Places that are navigable, so you can take cotton bales down the river and send them to market or bring supplies up the river, right? So, and you guys know this, but Austin picks the Brazos and Colorado rivers because of the suitability of the soil for cotton cultivation, right? And for shipments up and down the Brazos and Colorado rivers that can go to New Orleans, which is going to be the major port for all this stuff. And so here's a map that Austin drew of the beginnings of his colony around these two particular rivers that he hopes is going to entice people to abandon the United States for this new place beyond American borders, right? It's a big ask. And Austin knows it's a really big ask. So he's got to advertise this, and he's got to advertise this well. So once he picks out his colony, so he's down over here. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but he's down over here in Texas, and he needs to get the word out back to the United States about how much awesomeness can be had if you'll come to his colony. So come on down, right? And the way news spread back in the 19th century, this is also a really interesting exercise to do with students to talk about how would you advertise back? Like today, they put something on Facebook Marketplace or like tweet about it or whatnot. Back then, everything news went around in newspapers. Right, every little city, every little town had its own newspaper, usually a couple newspapers. And the editors of those particular newspapers would steal stuff from other newspapers. So newspapers published in New Orleans would get read by newspaper editors in other cities like Atlanta, Georgia, or Richmond, Virginia, or New York. And those editors would take all the interesting stuff from the New Orleans newspaper, cut it out, literally, and put it in their newspaper. And that's the original cut and paste, right? That's how news would spread. And so if you had something pretty exciting, pretty salacious, and you publish it in the newspapers, hopefully it would spread into all the other newspapers because every newspaper was looking for good, interesting content to put in it. So Austin started writing, see all that to say, that when Austin decided to advertise his colony, the way he did it is that he wrote letters. What could be more exciting than that? He was writing letters about how amazing Texas was, and he sent them to the New Orleans newspapers where they got published. And then the New Orleans newspapers went out from there, and that spread the word. And it got republished in newspapers across the South and across the North and across the entire United States, where Austin was he was in salesman mode, man. He was selling his goods, and they're pretty exciting stuff. Because Austin could really state unequivocally that this place is amazing, right? And so this is from an advertisement Austin placed. He says, this is how he's describing Texas. The richness of the soil, the healthfulness of the climate, its contiguity to the sea, and other natural advantages promise Americans who come to Mexico a reward to our labors which few spots on the globe could furnish to an equal extent, right? This place is Eden. And this is the thing about the 19th century. You had to take his word for it. You can't get on Google Earth and go take a good screenshot of what it actually looks like. You don't know, right? This is before the ability to see or get information about all kinds of places. You either trusted Austin or you didn't. So he could play this sucker up pretty good, right? You're imagining, again, it's a great exercise with students to imagine, like, if you read this, would you believe him? Would you uproot your entire family and make your way out here? Right? These are big things to ask for. So Austin knows he can't just say that it's Eden, so trust me. He has to actually sell people why this is going to be not just beautiful, but like the right place. And Austin has some things to sell, or to offer, I should say. He has some things to offer that were incredible for people who are reading in these American newspapers about what was available in Texas. So Austin said, if you come to my colony, and he's talking to the men only, that was the only people who were eligible for these grants. But if you come, you get 4,428 acres basically for just showing up, right? Which, when we teach this class, and you guys who've taught this before, that's just an obscenely large number. And students have a hard time, I think, wrapping their minds around just how much, unless they come from a ranching family, how much land that really is. But that's 7 square miles of land. I mean, it's just obscene. And it's not quite free, but it's pretty close to free. You don't actually have to pay for the land itself, right? You have to pay for surveying. Talk about that in a second. But that's a lot of land, right? More than you could ever hope to own, ever in your lifetime in the United States. And it won't just keep you wealthy. It'll be something you can bequeath to your children and your grandchildren. It'll set up your entire family for the rest of the generations to come by having that much land. Right? That's powerful. But wait, you say, that's not all. This is a late night infomercial. And say, like, hey, if you bring your wife, you get an extra 200 acres. She doesn't get those 200 acres. You get those 200 acres. But bring your wife and we'll give you even more land, right? Got kids? Of course you do. It's the 19th century. There's no birth control. You probably have 400 of them. Bring each one of them and you get 100 acres for each one of those kids. They don't get that land. You do. But bring your wife, bring your kids. They're putting a premium, Austin is, on families, right? He doesn't want just single men. He doesn't want just a couple of dudes who come out there who are planning to buy this land and then turn around and sell it. He wants families who will stay there, cultivate it, invest in the land, invest in the colony, all that sort of stuff. So that's why he's structuring the land policies. But he also wants to attract wealthy people, particularly wealthy people who will grow cotton, because that's what he knows is the cash crop. He knows that's what's going to be valuable. So he also pushes those who have enslaved people to bring those enslaved people with them. You get an additional 50 acres for every enslaved person that you bring with you. So what Austin's putting a premium on is families, but also established planters, cotton planters from Mississippi, ideally those wealthy enough to own slaves. These are the people who can invest. These are the people who can bring capital. These are the people who can transform his colony from nothing, from what he's creating, to a thriving community of some sorts. Now, if you read that in the newspaper in 1821, 1822, woo, that was going to be exciting. All right. But there were some requirements. Austin doesn't hide that either. He says there's a couple things you got to do, though. It's not just completely giving away land. All right. Requirement number 1, you have to be Catholic. And that's something that the Spanish had established in their original contract with Moses Austin, Steve's dad. I know Stephen F. Austin pretty well, so I call him Steve sometimes. He's okay. But you had to be Catholic. That's Spain was Catholic. Mexico will also be a Catholic country, so that's just basically established. But you can see I put in apostrophes, wink, wink, because this never gets enforced. It just doesn't. The Spanish before them and then Mexico afterward has no ability whatsoever to actually enforce this requirement. It's only on paper, right? The people in the United States, however, don't know that. So this did keep quite a number of Americans from coming to Austin's colony, because being Catholic or being Protestant could be a very big point of identity for a lot of people in the 19th century. So there were a lot of folks who said, well, if I have to be Catholic, I'm not going to go. Right? When you arrived, you didn't have to just be Catholic. You also had to bring letters of good character. We would call these letters of recommendation today. But Austin didn't want, vagabonds or guys who'd broken out of jail and were escaping the law to show up. So he required that you bring letters of recommendation with you, which we have them today. They had them back then. It was a way to vouch for somebody and say, this guy's a, stand-up character. Because Austin really did. He wanted to have his colony built on, reputable people who could do a good job. All right. So he's looking for families, slaveholders, cotton farmers, ideally who can say at least they're Catholic, but who can, be upstanding citizens. That's what he's looking for. And then Austin was very clear. You do need some money. This isn't completely free. For one thing, the land is free, but you got to pay to have it surveyed and a deed issued. And, there's a lot of legal documents that Austin's going to take care of. Austin charged 12.5 cents an acre for doing it. Which, just to put that in some context for you, federal land in the United States went for $1.25 an acre. So this is much cheaper, like orders of magnitude cheaper. But Austin, this is actually very clever on Austin's part, because Austin knows most of these people aren't going to be able to pay the $550 that comes to. So what he does is he says, well, you can pay me in anything. It can be chickens, it can be crop of cotton after you've grown a year or two, it can be land. And this is what a lot of people did. So if you're getting 7 square miles, you're not going to farm all of that. So you can give Austin 1 or 2 square miles of that back, and you still have 5 square miles. All right. And then that's free of charge now to you. And then Austin gets an extra couple of square miles of land. And you can see Austin will soon become the biggest landowner in the entire Mexican Texas area. Part of what he hopes will help make the fortune of himself and his family as well. Right. You also need some money because you need a year's worth of supplies if this is going to work out in Texas. There is no Walmart down the street. There is no Home Depot. There is none of that sort of stuff. Right. So you're going to need to bring all your own stuff to be able to supply yourself for at least a year till the cotton crop and the corn crop, which is what you're actually going to eat, comes in. Right. So Austin makes this announcement. He then goes back to Louisiana to get his stuff. He had a mailbox in Louisiana where he told people to write him. When he gets back there, it is just overflowing stuff to the gills with people from all over the United States asking, can I come to Mexico? And so Austin's amazed, and he's like, man, I wish I didn't have a limit of just 300 families. I bet I could probably settle a whole lot more. He actually writes a letter to the Tejanos in San Antonio. See a quote from it right here. He says, I'm convinced that I could take on 1,500 families as easily as 300 if I was permitted to do so. It's basically saying, can I have room for more? And then Tejanos say, let's just start with 300. We'll just do that one, see what happens, and we'll go from there, right? So people came to Austin's colony as quick as they could. There were 2 routes you could come. You could come overland on these roads, the Camino Real, which is the Royal Road, Atacosito Road down here along the coast. Most people didn't do that, though. They actually would go to New Orleans, where they would get supplies in large numbers, and then they would take a ship, which actually was cheaper in many cases. A lot easier to move freight and heavy stuff on a boat than over wagons. But people would take those, and then they'd come over New Orleans up to the coastline of Texas over here. So ships from New Orleans start making regular trips to the Texas coast, where they would let out, usually on the Brazos River, some on the Colorado. But you can see this is a map of Austin's colony itself. You'd get dropped off usually at the mouth of the Brazos, and then you'd make your way up the river. This is your first thing to do. You'd go to San Felipe, which is the little town that Austin had made his headquarters. It's basically where his house is. And you'd present yourself to Austin, and he'd say, hey, great, good to see you. You're Catholic, right? Wink, wink. Let me see your letters of rec. Fantastic. You're not a terrible person. And you tell him, go out and find where you want your land, and we'll survey it for you. All right. And you get to go off and pick out what you wanted. Can you imagine? It's just amazing, right? And so people came from all over the United States. One of the best examples of this is this guy right here. His name is Jared Gross. He's a really good example of the kinds of people who came to Austin's colony. Gross was a Southerner. He was a native of Virginia. He lived in South Carolina for a while, but he moved to Alabama during the Cotton Revolution that we talked about. And he has a big plantation out there with a lot of slaves. But then the Panic of 1819 happens. Everything collapses economically in the southern United States. And so Jared Gross is worried he's going to lose everything until he reads in the newspaper about Austin's colony. And so he's got a family. He's got a lot of slaves. He can get an enormous amount of land, just enormous amount of land. So he packs everybody up into 50 wagons. He actually comes overland. He doesn't take a ship. 50 wagons with 90-something enslaved people, and they make their way into Texas, come down the the Brazos River, present himself to Stephen F. Austin and San Felipe. This is exactly who Austin's been hoping for, people like this. So Gross goes out and picks out his land. You can see it's marked here on the Brazos, Gross's plantation, which is actually known as Bernardo. And they start building plantations and farms. And this is what all the Texas colonists did. They look a lot like this. This is a cotton farm in Texas. You can see we're on the far frontier, because this is, when you think of cotton plantations, this is not usually what it looks like in your head. We're usually thinking of a big Mississippi plantation, but Texas is on the cotton frontier. And this is right here. This log cabin here is the big house, right? And all these little houses behind it, these are slave cabins. And then I don't know if you can see it over here on the right, this building over here, circle down here, this is actually a cotton gin. And then this teepee looking thing on the right, if you can see that, that is a cotton press. So this is actually a cotton plantation, much like what Jared Gross was setting up. And I like talking about Gross because he really represents the kinds of colonists that both Austin was looking for and who Austin got. If you count, which I've actually done this, all the places that Austin's colonists came from, what it comes to is 90%. You can see that right there on your screen. 90% came from the American South, which means they're coming from Mississippi and not Maine, Alabama and not Illinois. And it's not that people in Maine and Illinois or New York or Vermont or wherever don't want free land. It's that this land was seen as good for a particular kind of crop. So again, geography matters. And this is seen as cotton country, which is why it's appealing to Southerners who are moving west looking for cotton lands. And the overwhelming percentage of them are coming from the American South. And so when these people come, much like Jared Gross, they're bringing cotton, but they're also bringing slavery into Mexico, right? They're taking the model of Mississippi and bringing it to Mexico. And slavery is what made the Mississippi plantations, or at least that's what the planters in Mississippi perceived, made these plantations incredibly profitable. And so from the earliest colony moments, enslaved people were being brought in large numbers. Jared Gross is the largest slaveholder in the colony, but he's by far not the only one. In 1825, there was a census done of Stephen F. Austin's colony. It's the first census that we have. And in that census, we found there's almost a quarter of the people in Austin's colony were enslaved. It means pretty much every fourth person was an enslaved person. Because they're replicating Mississippi. They're replicating Alabama. That's what they're doing here. And they're being very successful in doing it, all right? Up and down this river right here, they carve out all kinds of plantations. And we know this because Austin made maps of this. This is actually, it's called the Connected Map. It's at the General Land Office in Austin, Texas today. It's a beautiful, gorgeous map that Austin made of his colony that showed all the different tracts of land everybody had. Everybody tried to get waterfront property, so they'd have rivers of the highways of the 19th century. So you can see J.P. Coles here, Asia Mitchell, J.P. Bailey, folks like that. And you can see, this is on the Brazos River. These are roads. They're developing the region, just like the Tejanos wanted, just like Austin wanted. You can also see how much land Austin gets. He has huge tracts of land. And then over here on the right, on Oyster Bayou right here, this is Jared Gross. He's got some serious amount of land too, right? Things are going according to their plan. But there's a problem. Mexico has approved none of this because, remember, Moses Austin's contract was with Spain. And so Stephen F. Austin's contract is now still with Spain. And Mexico has not approved any of this. And it's forming a new government in Mexico City. And so by the time you get to 1822, 1823, Stephen F. Austin starts getting nervous about whether or not all this is going to remain legal, as Mexico calls a constitutional convention in Mexico City to decide not only what kind of government it's going to have, what kind of policies it's going to have about places like Texas. So I'm going to pause there, and then I'm going to hand the mic over to Courtney, who's got a bunch of really cool resources to show you guys. And I'm going to dive into the chat and start answering questions of anything you guys have. So keep them coming.
All right. So let's get this going. Day 3. Share. Okay. So for these first 2 materials that I'm sharing, the first one is a primary source activity about taking articles from the state colonization law of Coahuila y Tejas. And then the second one is an impresario application activity that is absolutely preposterous, and my students always love it. So let's start with the state colonization law. We've seen this set up before. There is a teacher note guide here because there's a matching component. And then there's kind of a brief how it works, but it's the same as how we've done it before. So the matching component, excuse me, is this one's a little longer. So this is one of the ones that I would say if you have classes that struggle with literacy or struggle with completing work, after the matching has been accomplished, this is one of the ones that might be a good idea to then assign, like in groups of 2 or 3 students, to assign each student one excerpt with one translation to do that one part of the work, and then have them share that information out with the rest of the class. That could save some time and make sure that struggling learners get all of the work done without having them feel overwhelmed by having to do that all themselves. So there are 9 articles here that I have picked out from the state colonization laws. And then 2 of the articles at the very bottom are actually requirements specific to Austin settlement. And they go over things that Andrew mentioned about making sure that you have letters of good moral character, making sure that you have a good job, making sure that you respect the laws of the nation, that you are, this one showing like proving your Christianity. One talking about the length of time you must be there, and in that time you have to present the families that you said you would bring, and you have to have improved the land or your contract is revoked. There's one Article 19 about American Indians' role in all of this, and that they are to be accepted into markets without having to pay any kind of taxes, and that if they want to take part in the impresario system, they are welcome to do that. There's one talking about how the impresarios for the first 10 years do not have to pay any kind of sales tax or duty. This one, Article 46, is the article about slavery. And basically all it says is that the people coming into Texas will respect the existing laws about slavery. And I've also included Article 30, not from the colonization law, but from the imperial colonization law that placed those restrictions on slavery. It didn't outlaw it, but it limited, once you get there, you can't trade enslaved people, and enslaved people born in the state when they hit 14 are free. And then those last 2 are specific to Austin's colonies about speaking Spanish as the language of communication with the government, and then making sure that they erect churches in all of their towns. So this is a little bit longer. I would say, again, your advanced students or your students that are high performers could probably do this on their own. I would read through all of these first, have the students follow along. You just read them in order. And then, like in some of the activities before, there are the translation cards. So this first one saying all foreigners who in the virtue of general law of 18th August 1824 wish to remove to any of the settlements of the state of Coahuila y Tejas are at liberty to do so, and the said state invites and calls them. They would match that. Mexico's inviting any foreign person who wants to lawfully settle in Texas to come to move here. For students who struggle with the matching, I would say for my advanced students, after we read through all of the excerpts, I kind of set them loose. I don't have many of those classes though, or I didn't when I taught. For my grade level classes, for my students with special education or 504 requirements who really struggle with literacy and this big chunks of work, I would myself read each excerpt a second time through individually, kind of talk them through. It's like a bridge between what it's saying and what the translation they're looking for is saying. And then pause for about a minute, let them search for that translation, and then check to make sure that we have the correct translation before moving on. So I would walk them through that matching step. So they would match. The matching letters, you can see it doesn't start A, B, C, D, it's F, B. That way they're all out of order and they have to kind of, figure out what order they go in. And like I mentioned before, the matching answer key is here in the teacher guide. So that's the matching. And then the materials are pretty similar to how I've set this activity up before. They have the article numbers listed. There's Article 1, Article 2, Article 5. They put the letter of the translation and then they paraphrase the article. You can set a word limit, no more than 5 words or no more than 3 words if you really want to challenge them to be concise. And then for the advanced students, I have them choose one of the laws that they think would have been most important to Mexico and explain why they think it would have been that important. And here's something where it's opinion based. You can use reason and logic and evidence or what you think Mexico would have supported or prioritized. But it's one of those things where there's really not any wrong answer. So this is going to have them use their own powers of reasoning and argument to put together their response. In the grade level work, same setup at the very top, but here, instead of just giving them free rein to write, I have a sentence stem so that they kind of see the structure of what they're going to write and they fill in what's missing. I believe that article blank would have been the most important to the Mexican government because blank. And then for the foundations level work, I've taken out one step. So they have the article excerpt in the full translated from Spanish, in the full English. They would write the translation, and then here is an even shorter, more concise paraphrasing of the article. So as you read through the excerpt, they can then read this short paraphrasing of the article. Americans are invited to come and live in Texas and follow the laws. And then they're looking for that one in the middle on those translation cards that sounds most like the excerpt and most like the paraphrasing. So it's a lot less writing. And then down here again, theirs down here is more like the grade level, since they didn't do much writing up at the top. So they have the sentence stem and the structure that they're putting their answer in, and they're just filling it in with what article they think would have been most important to Mexico and why. So that's those. I would give that a day. Again, my classes were about 47 minutes. And then with those supports, like if I have students that are fully capable of doing the work on their own with very little guidance, read through it, turn them loose. But the rest of those supports can really help in grade level students and then students who have other accommodations or modification requirements. So there's that. The next one, now this next one is not a primary source activity, but it is absolutely one of my favorite activities that I do because it is just ludicrous. So it's now reviewing applications for Texas impresarios. I have made 5 fake applications for 5 fake people who are trying to apply to be an impresario and get this land grant in Texas. The beginning of this is just reminding them what they're looking for. You should be Catholic or willing to convert. You should have good moral character, all of these things. And then for each of these 5 applicants, they're going to write the applicant name. Then they're going to put a check or an X in each of these categories: Catholic, speak Spanish, will follow slave laws, all of this. And then they will accept or deny that applicant. And not one of the applicants is someone that you would fully accept without reservations or that you would fully deny without like a second glance. So a lot of this is them having to like reason out, is this person good enough to accept and under what conditions? So if they accept someone that's not a perfect fit, I tell them to write the condition that they're accepted under. Well, this person, you know, is a hard worker, they have a useful job, good moral character, they're not Catholic, they don't speak Spanish. If they're willing to learn to speak Spanish, if they're willing to convert, as Andrew said, you know, quote unquote convert, then yes, we fully accept them. So this gives an element of writing. It makes them remember like what is required and what else would they have to do to be accepted. And so that part is fairly reasonable. These are the same. There's 5 different little sections for the applicants. Where it gets wacky is I just really love a good ridiculous name. And I love making the students do things that are a little bit ridiculous because they want to at the 7th grade level, but they want to be forced to, like given permission to, without, you know, it's like, oh, she's making me do this. So the ridiculous part comes in here. All of their names are absolutely preposterous. Here's the application for Marcus Patootie-Waddle. He's a pretty good one. He has a family. It gives background data, his health and medical history to see, you know, is he going to kick the bucket here in a few years? These little yellow cards give some moral character information. Marcus Patootie-Waddle fell into hard times with their family. They're hoping for a new start. Moral character or just sometimes background context, and then additional notes. They're Quakers, which is a religion that believes in equality no matter your race or gender, whatever. So here's Marcus Patootie-Waddle. Here is Old Man Stinkin' Jenkins the 6th, his poor family full of Old Man Stinkin' Jenkins 1 through 5. Dan the Tan Running Man, and just looking at his picture, but I tell the kids, you know, don't judge him by his picture because there's some things that he might have going for him. Abigail Tinkle Dinkelstein, adore her, and Bubba Magoodle, a real winner. So basically, whenever they have finished accepting or denying these people and putting the conditions on their applications, I put up a sentence stem. I accepted blank because, or I denied blank because, and I make them say it out. So the students, I'll say, let's talk about some of these people. Tell me who you accepted. I accepted Abigail Tinkle Dinkelstein, and it just makes my heart so happy, and the kids giggle. And then they remember in the future, like, well, what were the requirements for being an impresario? Oh, remember Abigail Tinkle Dinkelstein wasn't Catholic, so you have to be Catholic. Or, you know, Bubba Magoodle, we didn't accept him because he was a gambler and he ran his businesses into the ground or whatever. But I really love making them say the names in their sentence stems, and it kind of gives the kids just a little bit of goofiness, and that really makes this stick. So that is those two materials here. This will also take a day. And what you can do for students who struggle is you can just have them accept or deny one. You know, like sign, like you can have, you have Bubba Magoodle, you have Abigail Tinkle Dinkelstein. Or for students who really struggle with a lot of writing, some of my special education students who had a lot of limitations on their writing, I wouldn't make them explain their answer or just write it in one word, like deny, not Catholic. That's 2 words, but still. So you can limit the amount of writing they have to do there. So there's only one worksheet for advanced grade level and foundations here, but you can just require, like at advanced, I want you to write in 1 or 2 complete sentences or 2 or 3 complete sentences why you're accepting or denying this person, and then limit the writing as it goes, or just take out the writing component altogether if you have students who really have limitations on their writing. And with that, I will hand it back to Andrew, and I'll jump into the chat to answer any questions.
All right. I love that assignment because I've seen Courtney show me that one before, and she and I are both of the opinion. I'm gonna speak for Courtney, but we've had some really good conversations about how powerful it is to use humor in the classroom. I know that's true for me in the college classroom, but I know it's true for my own kids. And I actually do a lot of talking in 7th grade classrooms up here in North Texas. And, you know, teaching is about a lot of things, an enormous number of things, but the most fundamental thing is engagement. Like if the kids are engaged, if you can catch their attention and you can keep it, they'll learn so much more. And there's something about like emotionality that makes things sticky with teaching that I think is so powerful. And so, you know, I have my own set jokes and stuff. I think most of us do, and it's what those are the things my students tend to remember the most. So I love this the goofiness of this assignment that's still tackling something really serious, and having the students like you know, in it builds this sort of level of connectivity that I think is hard to find anywhere else. Anyway, all right. So I'm diving back in. Where we left off is that things are booming in Texas. You guys know me, right? I like to pull the camera back and see the big picture of what's going on in both Mexico and the United States. And this is one of those moments we need to pull the camera back to understand what's going on in Mexico City and this new Mexican nation that's being established, right? Because there's a constitutional convention called in Mexico City in 1823 to write a federal constitution to decide what this new nation is going to be and how it's going to be run. And one of the big things they're going to argue about is what's going to happen in Texas and what's going to happen about slavery in Texas. Right. So my central question for this next section is, why did slavery, because it does, become such a point of contention between Mexico City and the people in Texas? Because really, when you look at the 1820s, there are conflicts between the people in Texas and Mexico City and some of the state authorities in Coahuila, but it only comes down to one thing, the slavery issue throughout most of the 1820s. 1830s, it gets more complicated, but in the 1820s, that's the thing that tends to be a fight. So we really need to understand why. And it gets to the heart of what's going on in Texas, right? So as we said, there's a Constitutional Convention down in Mexico City. And so representatives are sent from all the territories of this new Mexican nation, you know, from Yucatan all the way up to California, who make their way down to Mexico City, where they meet here. This is the Hall of Deputies, kind of like the House of Representatives, sort of, in the United States. But this is where they come together and they're debating everything. Everything's on the table. I mean, Mexico knows it's going to be Catholic, but other than that, should it be a monarchy? Should it be a federal republic? Should it be something in between? All these things are on the table. And they try out some early ideas, like they do actually try out monarchy for a hot minute. Doesn't work out. But they finally decide they're going to write a constitution for a federal republic and build a nation out of that. And when they're doing that, Austin is nervous, so nervous that they'll outlaw American immigration into Mexico, that he rides all the way down to Mexico City. That is a long ride on horseback, right? He goes 2,000 miles, comes down to Mexico City so he can lobby in person to please don't outlaw my colony. This is a good idea, I promise you. We Americans who are coming in promise to be loyal to Mexico. So he's there advocating and lobbying. And the Tejanos are there as well. This gentleman, Jose Antonio Navarro, he actually doesn't go, but the guy who does is named Erasmo Seguin, and I don't have a picture of him, so I'm using Navarro as my stand-in. But the Tejanos in Texas are actually the representatives at this Constitutional Convention, not the Americans, not Austin. And so, they have to work together to try to convince most of the Mexican legislators that Texas needs to allow American immigration to continue. And so they go around and they talk to everybody they possibly can. And what's really amazing is that Austin is surprised, and the Tejanos are also surprised to learn that American colonization, bringing Americans into Texas, proves to not be controversial amongst almost all the representatives in Mexico City. My students find surprising. They usually assume that the Mexican authorities will be nervous about bringing in the Americans. And I always try to point out to them, well, they're aware of the dangers. So that's there, but they see a lot of potential upsides. They just need more people there, people who are not Comanches, people who will swear loyalty to the Mexican nation. And if these guys will come in with this new economic development of cotton, which again is booming like oil will boom in the 20th century, that's a real positive, hopefully, for Mexico, is what a lot of these leaders in Mexico City think. So most leaders in Mexico City, I mean, it wouldn't be their first choice, but it, again, feels like the least bad option available. So Austin is very relieved. The Tejanos are very relieved to learn that, they're pretty supportive of this idea, right? What is controversial, however, is the labor system that these Americans are going to be, or already are, bringing in to Mexico, right? This is the part where we have problems. Because when these colonists like Jared Gross are leaving Mississippi and Alabama, they're bringing cotton, but they're also bringing slavery into Mexico. And this is an open question for most Mexican legislators. Do we want Mexico to endorse slavery? Or do we want it to not have anything to do with slavery? Now is the time for them to decide this, as they're writing their constitution, right? And so Austin is having conversations about that as well. And when he comes to realize very quickly, and we know this because he wrote it down in all these letters, what Austin comes to realize very quickly is that slavery is something that almost all Mexican legislators are against. Slavery is one of the very few things that almost all Mexicans across almost all of Mexico can agree that they want to outlaw. All right. And so let's talk about that for a second, because I think it's really important to understand the Mexican perspective on the slavery issue. And as you can see, there are three major reasons that most Mexicans across most of Mexico oppose slavery at this moment. All right. Reason number one, Mexico had just fought and won in a war for independence. They fought for liberty and freedom, their own, of course. And, that seems quite the contradiction to then turn around and then endorse slavery in your constitution or laws or whatever you guys end up writing for this new country, right? And, I think it's easy to dismiss ideology as just, pretty talk during this time period, but they don't really believe it. But a lot of them do believe it. And a lot of them do believe in the rights of man and the ideals of the Enlightenment that really brought in the whole age of revolutions that produces the American Revolution, Mexico's war for independence, and onward and outward from there. When Miguel Hidalgo announced the Grito de Dolores and the revolution or the Mexican War for Independence begins, one of the things he does is outlaw slavery officially. All right, nothing actually comes of that, but the point is, a lot of people thought this is the moment we should live up to this. And this is something the American founders of the United States also wrestled with, the contradiction in fighting for your own liberty and freedom and then not endorsing that further. All right, so that's reason number one. Reason number two is a little more practical. All right, chattel slavery of enslaved people of African descent did not exist in most Mexican states by the time Mexico becomes an independent country. All right. And I want to emphasize, Mexico had imported enslaved Africans in the 1500s and the 1600s who worked in a lot of those silver mines that I told you guys about a couple of days ago. But Mexico had, under Spanish rule, had really transitioned away from African labor, which was very expensive, to enslaved or coerced Indian labor, sometimes enslavement of Indians, which was a lot cheaper. And so it's not that there wasn't unfree labor in Mexico. There was. It's just that chattel slavery of Africans and African descent people, the way it was practiced in the United States, was not a part of most states in Mexico by the early 1820s. And that matters because that means most Mexican states can get rid of slavery without sacrificing almost anything. All right. They're not going to give up very much. All right. So that's reason number two. But reason number three is actually the most important, which is that, and you can see we've left Mexico. This is London right here, right? The Mexico needs international friends when it becomes a new nation. And the most important nation of the 19th century, the most powerful militarily and economically, was the British Empire. All right. If you lived in the 19th century, you lived in a British world. And so if Mexico is going to succeed as a new country, it needs trade agreements with people like the British. It needs loans from people or from countries like the British. And so the British are by far the most influential nation, and the British actually own the vast majority of Mexican debt. All right. And by the time you get to the 1820s, the British Empire is also the leading force in trying to stamp out the international slave trade and the rise of abolitionism in the Atlantic world, right? So for most Mexicans, if they endorse slavery, they might alienate the British. They cannot afford to do that. If they outlaw slavery, well, then that'll be good for their relationship with the British. That'll be good for Mexico. So I say all that to say those three reasons combined mean that almost all Mexicans across this map of all these different parts of Mexico would agree now's the time to outlaw slavery, right? There's just one weird pocket of Mexico, just one little area in the corner, northeastern kind of edge over there, where anyone is saying anything different, and that's in Texas, all right? And so Stephen F. Austin is clearly saying, like, look, I don't like slavery either. Austin said he doesn't own slaves. That's actually not true. He owned a few people at different times. But he's saying, like, this is a necessary evil. If you're going to have people, or yeah, if you're going to have people moving into Texas from the southern United States, the only way they're going to come is if they can grow cotton. And the only way they're going to leave Mississippi and Alabama to grow cotton in Texas is if they can bring the labor system with them that will make that profitable. If you take away slavery, they're just going to stay in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana, where slavery is legal. That was his argument, right? And the Tejanos endorse Austin's argument because they want the population to move in. They want the economic development to move in. For them, this is the legacy of the Spanish failures in the region. They need to make up for all those problems. And this seems to be the only way that they're going to be able to do that. And so Stephen F. Austin lobbies hard in Mexico City to keep slavery legal because he thinks it is the key, the linchpin of his column, right? And he said it a million different ways. This is the most succinct sentence where he just says it bald-faced. And I'm saying bald-faced. He's saying it openly. He's not hiding it. He's not pretending. He's not ashamed of it. He's like, these are just facts, is what he would argue. And he'd say, the primary product that will elevate us from poverty is cotton. And we cannot do this without the help, that's a nice euphemism there, Steve, of slaves, right? He's just being very clear about the relationship, the equation as he sees it. And the Tejanos understand this. So down there you see a quote from Erasmo Seguin, who was actually writing to somebody else tell Steve Austin, I'm well aware that the abolition of slaves will hinder immigration, right? So they're both aware, they're both on the same page. They both go around trying to lobby as many people as they possibly can to be on the side of keeping slavery legal. Again, not as an end in itself, but as a means to the end of populating Texas, basically making up for what the Spanish had not been able to accomplish. Right. So again, just to say we've been saying these last 2 days, the connections across these units, across these eras are powerful because what's happening in the mid-1820s goes all the way back to the Spanish colonial period, which really goes back to where the Indians first developed societies in different parts of Texas and how the geography affects all of that. You can draw straight lines between all of these things. And all those lines right now move right here to the House of Deputies in Mexico City, where they're debating the Constitution. They end the debates. Austin leaves, goes back to Texas. The Tejanos, well, actually, Erasmus stays for a while, but eventually goes back to Texas. And then in October of 1824, the Constitution is finished. The Constitution of 1824. You guys have heard of this. If you've taught Texas history before, you know about this. This is the Constitution that Santa Anna will overthrow in 1835. So it's very, very important. And it lays out how Mexico is going to be operating, how it's going to rule, all that sort of stuff. When it gets to Texas, this document, all right, the Tejanos get it in San Antonio, the Stephen F. Austin gets it in East Texas in his colony. They're terrified when they get this because they're afraid it's going to outlaw slavery. So when it arrives in the mail, they throw it down the table, they open it up, they go through page by page by page, looking for whatever it says about slavery. It says nothing. Nothing at all about slavery. So they flip it over. They go back through it a second time. Did we miss it? Is it in there? Nothing in there says anything about slavery. And that's not a mistake. That's on purpose. Because as you guys know, if you taught Texas history before, this is a federal constitution. What does that mean? That means it divides power between the national government in Mexico City and the many state governments across Mexico. The national government has certain powers. The state governments have certain powers. And the way this Constitution was written, so that's federal division of power. It's much like the United States Constitution, right? States have certain powers and rights. The federal government has certain powers and rights. The way this Constitution is written is that anything that is written out in the Constitution itself is a power for the national government in Mexico City. So it talks about, running the army, about taxation, about foreign relations, things like that. Those are all powers of the national government. Anything that's not mentioned in the Constitution is a power for who? The state governments. So if it's not mentioned in the Constitution, that doesn't mean they forgot about it. It means they gave it to the states, and they're the ones in charge. So if you don't mention slavery in the national Constitution, who's going to deal with the slavery issue? The different states across Mexico, right? And that turns out to be an absolutely brilliant move, because Mexico can have it both ways now. That means that all the different states will get to decide slavery, which means all the different states across Mexico are almost assuredly going to outlaw slavery, right? All of them. Except maybe that one northeastern corner in Texas, there may be something different there. But everybody else gets to decide it for themselves, which is actually how the US pretty much handles the slavery issue. They make it a state issue for them to decide individually. That way, Mexico can tell the British Empire, we've taken care of the slavery issue. It's just one little wacky corner over there where things might be slightly different. Now, imagine you're back in San Antonio. You're a Tejano. Or you're in Austin's colony. You're in San Felipe de Austin, the capital of Austin's colony. And you hear this. What's your reaction? How are you feeling? They're really excited. They're like, woo! This is the best we could have hoped for. We get to write our own Constitution, and we can decide the slavery issue and all kinds of other issues that are really important to us. That's fantastic. Yes, thank you. That'd be really great. And, they're pretty excited for about, 10 seconds. They're pretty excited. When they then read the fine print and realize, oh, wait, Texas is not going to be its own state under Mexico. Why? Because Texas still doesn't have enough people. So once again, beat this one into the ground. The legacies of the Spanish and the Spanish period play enormous roles going forward, and we can see them directly right here. The fact that the Spanish did not have enough people in Texas means that now Texas cannot be its own independent state under Mexico, and that's going to have huge ramifications. Because Texas is going to get connected. You guys can see it on the map. Its neighbor there on the southwest along the Rio Grande, Coahuila, right down over there, right? So watch the map here. It's going to go from here to, we're connected now to Coahuila. That was Texas. Boom, now it's Coahuila, Texas, right? And so we make the very awkwardly named state of Coahuila, Texas. And the new capital of Texas is not in fact in Texas. It's way down here. You guys see down here at the bottom of Coahuila, Saltillo, all right? That's the new capital of Texas, which you can look at the map there. You can see that is very far from Texas, very far away indeed, all right? And there's going to be a new legislature in Coahuila, the Saltillo Congress, that is going to write a new constitution for Coahuila and Texas. It's going to decide issues like slavery, but also immigration and all kinds of things like that. All right. So the slavery issue doesn't get solved; it just kind of gets kicked down the road up to Tex, well, actually up to Coahuila. Things are going to go right there. Austin's pretty excited, a little nervous because the slavery issue hasn't been decided, but his colony's still going. And it's going kind of gangbusters, really. The Tejanos, they're very excited because there's a lot of new people moving into Austin's colony, a lot of new people who aren't Comanches, and the economy's starting to boom. There's all these ships coming in from New Orleans. The economic development that they were hoping for is literally now at their doorstep. So things by the mid 1820s are going the way Austin and the Tejanos really wanted them to go. Right? Americans are coming in very significant numbers. Austin has fulfilled his old 300 contract, which I always point this out to my students. That's 300 families. That's not 300 people. You know how many people that was? It was roughly 3,000 people. So think about this. This is another great contrast to show our students. How long did it take the Spanish to get 3,000 people into Texas? Pretty much the whole time the Spanish were there, more or less a century. All right. How long did it take Austin's colony to bring in 3,000 people? 4 years. Think about that speed, right? And then Austin's immediately issued another contract and then another contract after that. Like it's just going and going and building on itself. And that is why the Tejanos are just thrilled to death by the mid 1820s that this is going so well, because it's bringing stability to the region, development, economic expansion, all these kinds of things. That's all going really well. But the thing that's hanging out there, of course, is that there's going to be a new state constitution written in Coahuila, and it's going to deal with the slavery issue. And what that produces is really the open question, right? Meanwhile, Stephen F. Austin is no longer the only game in town, right? There are other Americans who watched what Austin has done and said, you know, I can do that. And if I do that, I could probably get an enormous amount of land for myself and for my family on the same scale that Stephen F. Austin is doing. It sounds pretty good. And so there's a lot of guys, like Green DeWitt's a really famous example, who will go and get their own colonization contracts and things like that. Some of these guys try really hard. None of them, I'm going to say this, none of them are anywhere near as successful as Stephen F. Austin. And the most spectacular example of that is Hayden Edwards. Oh, I love talking about this guy because he's a mess and a half and a really fascinating character. So Hayden Edwards is a slave trader from Mississippi, land speculator. He's a lot of things. He comes to Saltillo in 1825 after the Constitution's been written. And he gets a colonization contract to be an impresario, which is a land agent, much like Stephen F. Austin, start his own colony. And when he gets his land, he's given the land in far east Texas, right around Nacogdoches, over here on the far right. So you guys see that over there where Nacogdoches is? Now, again, you know me, I love to draw connections from long periods. So Nacogdoches is the first place that the Spanish had set up their missions, right? And those missions had not succeeded. But from going all the way back to the 1690s, but really the 17 teens, you've got missions there that have some Spaniards in the region. That becomes the seedbed for Nacogdoches. So you've had Spanish families in this region for a very long time. And when Hayden Edwards shows up in the mid 1820s, he threatens to throw those guys off their land, because what Hayden Edwards does is he walks in and he starts putting up all these signs that say, I am Hayden Edwards. I am now the ruler of East Texas. He also calls himself the military commander of East Texas under absolutely no authority. But he puts this up there and it says, you must show me, if you live here now, you must show me the deed to your land to prove you have legal title. And if you can't do it, I will throw you off your land and I'll just sell it to the first Anglo-American who shows up. And it's literally what Hayden Edwards does. Now, being an impresario like Austin took a lot of skill, diplomacy, all kinds of patience. And unfortunately, Hayden Edwards had none of those qualities whatsoever. And so he puts up these things everywhere. the local Spaniards and now Mexicans, people who've been living there a long time, they don't have title to their land, but they've been there forever, and they start getting into fights with him and screaming matches. They start writing angry letters back to San Antonio asking for help from the Tejano leadership in San Antonio. Those guys start writing letters all the way up to Mexico City. Eventually, word about Hayden Edwards and his shenanigans gets all the way up to the desk of Guadalupe Victoria, the president of Mexico. Do you know how bad you have to screw up in the mid 1820s to land on the desk of the Mexican president that quickly? I mean, it's catastrophic, but Hayden Edwards manages to do it. And it's the president of Mexico who orders that he get thrown out of Mexico. So word comes down to the Tejanos to throw out Hayden Edwards. Word gets to Nacogdoches. Hayden Edwards realizes his contract is going to get canceled. He's going to get thrown out. And so he reacts in the only reasonable way somebody could under these circumstances. He tries to overthrow the Mexican government, right? This is the Fredonian Rebellion, right? In November and really December of 1826, Hayden Edwards decides to try to punch back by just overthrowing the government in Texas in particular, by declaring Texas no longer Texas. Now it's the Republic of Fredonia. And he and a bunch of his friends, actually 12 of his friends, it's like 13 guys, which I just want to pause for a second. If you're taking notes, write this down. It's just 13 guys. We talk about the Fredonian Rebellion, and it sounds like this really big thing. It's 13 yahoos, 2 of whom are Cherokees, who go into this building here, the old stone fort in Nacogdoches, and they wave a flag saying it's Fredonia, and Mexico doesn't rule here anymore. But that's it. That's their rebellion. It's comically tiny in what they're doing, right? But it's going to have big long-term ramifications, because when this happens, right, this is the worst fear of Mexican leaders, either in San Antonio or in Saltillo or down in Mexico City, about what these Americans might do if we don't keep a good eye on them, right? Now, how does Hayden Edwards think that this is going to possibly work? He has 12 of his buddies with him, right? He can't take on, Mexico with that. So what he's expecting is that Stephen F. Austin and his colonists will join him in this rebellion. So he writes to Stephen F. Austin to tell him, like, hey, good news, I've started a rebellion. You guys will probably want to join us, right? What's Stephen F. Austin's reaction? No, this is a terrible idea, right? And he writes this beautiful letter that is just so angry to Hayden Edwards, basically saying, you guys are going to screw everything up. All right. And this is some of the letter right here. He says, the people in your quarter have run mad, or worse. The slave question, whether it's going to be legal or not, is now pending in the state legislature. The Constitution there is now forming. What influence are acts of this outrageous character calculated to have on the minds of the members of the legislature, and on the decision of the slave, or any other question involving the interests and prosperity of the new settlements? Basically, Austin is saying, you're going to screw up everything. This is terrible. Don't do it. And instead of riding to the aid of Hayden Edwards, Stephen F. Austin gathers up some of his colonists, and they ride against Hayden Edwards, along with Tejanos from San Antonio. Hayden Edwards then just runs to Louisiana and basically disappears for a while. And that's the end of the Fredonian Rebellion. But this Fredonian Rebellion is significant because it does 2 things. One, it convinces the Tejanos, who are close by, that they can trust the Americans, because it is Stephen F. Austin who helps put down the rebellion. So the Tejanos who are close by see how small the rebellion is, that they can trust Stephen F. Austin. But leaders in Saltillo or in Mexico City do not trust any of this, and they are much more worried about this. All right. And this is important because, as Stephen F. Austin said, in Saltillo, and I don't know how well you can see this picture here, but this is actually a picture of the downtown Saltillo around the 1840s. So it's as close as we're going to get to a time machine for Saltillo in 1826, 1827. But they were writing their state constitution. And the big question they had to decide was the issue of slavery, right? And when they published their constitution, which this is the constitution, it's called the Constitution of 1827, the state constitution, it was going to decide the issue of slavery. And when it got to Texas, the Anglos in Stephen F. Austin's colony, the Tejanos in San Antonio, once again pulled out the Constitution and they start rifling through it to see what it says about slavery. And very quickly, they find out that it says that slavery is going to get outlawed. All right. And it's Article 13 of this Constitution that outlaws slavery. But it does it very slowly. All right. What the Article 13 says is that slavery is going to be outlawed over the course of a generation. All slaves currently in Texas will stay slaves for the rest of their lives. The people who are going to be freed are the children of those slaves. All right. Those are the ones who are going to be freed. So slavery will take about a generation or so to go away, is the thought and the plan in Saltillo and in Coahuila. All right. And the reason they did it this way is that they thought that would sound very reasonable to the Texans. And so when news gets to Stephen F. Austin's colony, it doesn't sound reasonable to them. It sounds really scary, right? And we know this because Austin wrote some very clear letters explaining why this sounded scary. Because what Austin said was that nobody is going to leave the United States now and move to Texas if they are not going to be able to bring slaves with them into the region. Like if you end slavery, even if you end it gradually, slavery therefore is not going to be legal in Mexico. And so for Stephen F. Austin, that's just the death knell of his colony, which depends on cotton, and that is tied to slavery. So Austin comes up with a scheme to get around the outlawing of slavery. And what he does is he writes a proposal to the Tejanos to get a law passed. And what this law will say is that any contract that you sign in Mexico will be legal, sorry, any contract you sign in the United States will be legal in Mexico. So if you hire someone to build you a house in Louisiana, you sign a contract with them, that contract will still be legal when you get to Mexico. It sounds really innocent because it has to, because that's how it's going to get through the Saltillo legislature. But what's the purpose of this law? Well, the idea, and we know this was Stephen F. Austin's idea because he wrote notes about all of this. So we have it in his own handwriting. But what Austin was going to use this for is that then his migrant, the people coming to his colony could stop in Louisiana with their slaves, free them on paper, and then force their slaves to sign 99-year service contracts so that they'd be contracted labor, but not officially slaves anymore. And then they'd come in, and then slavery would continue just under the legal ruse of a contract, right? And they get this passed as a law. The Tejanos, and actually the guy on the right of your screen right now, Jose Antonio Navarro, he's the guy who gets it through the Saltillo legislature and gets it passed. And he knows what he's doing too. He's fully aware of the implications of this. They get it passed as Decree 56, and it does pass. And then Stephen F. Austin writes letters to the New Orleans newspapers that then get published across the United States, explaining exactly how you get around the laws against slavery in Mexico by having your slaves sign 99-year service contracts. All right. And actually, Stephen F. Austin actually wrote up a fill-in-the-blank contract that he had published in the newspapers so that they had the legal forum to do all of this and went out from there. All right. All of that just shows us one major thing, is that the cotton economy from the United States is what's driving these Americans into the region. And they tie that heavily to the slavery issue. But that puts them into conflict at different levels within Mexico and makes people there nervous. And this will get into a big fight over the question of federalism, which will define the 1830s, and we will talk about in a second. So I'm going to pause right there and then hand the mic back once again to Courtney, who's got a bunch of great resources for you guys. And then I'm going to dive into the chat per my usual.
All right. Okay. So looking at federalism in Mexico and the issue of slavery, our first material here is a material on slavery in Mexico. So the advanced work, starting with the advanced work, and this is something, this is a bit longer for the advanced students. If you were going to do this in a day, I would talk them through the steps and help them work through the steps in the beginning, especially. It starts with a timeline of slavery in Mexico. This is definitely not the word for all-encompassing. There's a word I'm looking for, but I can't think of it. but it's the major points that Andrew has brought up. So beginning with the imperial colonization law that starts putting some restrictions on slavery, moving on to 1827, the state constitution of Coahuila y Tejas, and these are not fully primary sources here. It's primary sources put in context. So like here, Emperor Iturbide made the imperial colonization law, blah, 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 and then quotes, and then you have a little primary source quote. For the state constitution of Coahuila y Tejas, it gives Article 13, which is the one that outlaws or sets up the outlawing of slavery. Here, Decree 56. This is straight from the decree itself. So all of this is primary source, talking about how, the first paragraph is talking about, to keep agriculture going, to keep development going in Texas. We have this decree. And the second part is talking about the contracts that don't go against the laws, that you've been entered into in a foreign state. These contracts are recognized in Mexico. And then the very last one, September 15th, 1829, is when Mexican President Vicente Guerrero established the Guerrero Decree, which officially abolished slavery in Texas. But then there's a law, it says the law would later be overturned, and protests from Texas got protests from Texas planters got Texas exempted from slavery bans. So there's some questions here that go with this about the restrictions that were imposed on slavery, and then just asking about the process of how it gets outlawed. Number 3 is asking about what Decree 56 could mean with regards to people working in Texas. And so it's just kind of asking the students to think through this process of slavery's been illegal or outlawed, illegalized, and what could Decree 56 mean for that? The next part is breaking down an American point of view on slavery in Mexico. This all comes from a letter by a man named Charles Douglas to Stephen F. Austin. It was written in 1829 before slavery was abolished officially by the Guerrero Decree. And it just kind of breaks down like why this person is saying slavery is essential, slavery is necessary, we can't get rid of slavery. And it's talking about things that also interestingly that he believed were worse than slavery. And some of the things are like in the third part, also forgetting the effect of their exclusive religion, which is infinitely more destructive than the former of these principles. So he's just talking about like slavery is not that bad in this guy's opinion. He goes on in 4 to talk about all these other things that Mexico supports that are worse in his opinion than slavery, which like monopolies and inequality and a standing army, and how if they legalize slavery, then it's going to increase the freed African American or African Mexican, the free Black population basically in Texas, and how he thinks that would just be a total abysmal failure. And so this part is presenting these parts of his letter. The bold words, A, language, B, present system, C, justly entitled. So some of them are phrases referring to things. And so here it has some matching, like which one of those bold words would be the current restrictions on slavery? B, present system. And then it asks a question, in the author's opinion, what? Now, this last part, you could just skip if you have absolutely no time, but it puts in some more of those new star item types into this assignment, using the primary source material that the students have been working with. So this is one of the harder star item types, the one where it gives you the chunk of a primary source, and then it asks you 2 questions, one based on sort of a big idea about the primary source, and then the second part asking which part of the primary source supports that idea, and then a short constructed response. So this is a pretty long activity. If you wanted to finish it all in one day, I would definitely take the students through it. Like do it as a class together. The grade level assignment, same idea to begin with, same setup, same questions here. The questions I think I made a little bit less rigorous. And then the same part here, the only thing this is missing is those star item type questions. And then the foundations activity, they have a lot more supports with the answers. So in the grade level and advanced, this question, what restrictions were placed on slavery in 1823 and 1827, that's open-ended in grade level and advanced. And here it gives them a list of things they can check. There's multiple choice, and then everything here is also multiple choice as well. So it limits that amount of writing. So there, the timeline of slavery in Mexico. The second material for this segment is excerpts, translated excerpts from the Mexican Constitution of 1824, going over things that have already been discussed in class about the national religion, the setup of the government, and showing, it doesn't specifically come out and say this, but it shows a lot of parallels with the US government. Article 5 is the longest, but really the only important thing that you would eventually get to point out here is that it breaks the country up into states, and Texas is not a state by itself, which is one of those things that Andrew had mentioned becomes a problem. Article 6 is talking about the three branches, much like the US. Article 7 is talking about a federalism, talking about Article 74 is the executive power and the judicial power. So just like the key components of their constitution, and then the work that goes with it is translations of each of those articles. So for the advanced work, here it says which article. This is, there are many states that make up the states, United States of Mexico, including Texas, join with another state. So they would refer back to this and see which one of those articles, it would be this one, is that translation referring to. So Article 5, I would put Article 5 right here. And then after you've gone through all of that, you would look for what are the similarities to the US government. And this is something, I mean, this is kind of a niche thing, because if you haven't spoken much about the US government, or if they don't know much about the US government, this might be something that needs a lot more support, or a lot more kind of context. But really there's only one thing in here that's not similar to the US government, which is the states, because of course the states are different. And then it says, write a sentence comparing the Mexican and US governments. It gives a sentence template. The grade level assignment is very similar, except the template is all written out for them. And the foundations level assignment is very similar, except there is no writing component at the end. It's just multiple choice. And that is the materials for that. I'm going to turn it back over to Andrew.
All right. All right. And now we're in the home stretch. All right, guys. Let's see here. Let me share my screen. All right. So, so the 1820s, up until this point, there's so much going on in Mexico, right? They're forming a government. They're forming state governments. They are trying to establish all these different pieces all at once. Meanwhile, in Texas, the colonization project is going as well as Austin could have hoped, that the Tejanos could have hoped. It's all kind of swirling all at once. It's this kind of rickety but growing scaffolding that they're building here. Question is, how long is it going to last? And that's really what the 1830s become so much about. Fights over what is the future of both Texas and Mexico writ large. And it all comes back to these battles over federalism. I know you guys talk about federalism in your classes, and I just want to sort of like break down a little bit for you guys why that's so important for understanding the 1830s, the road to the Texas Revolution, how all those different pieces connect to each other, right? So that's the essential question for this last part. How did fights over federalism in Mexico help push Texans eventually, almost reluctantly, toward revolution, right? So once again, I wanted to pull the camera back a little bit and talk about these ideas of centralism versus federalism. As Courtney was just talking about, introducing ideas about American government and such, so much of this requires really good structuring and background for students to try to understand. And centralism versus federalism is a really kind of weird, tough concept, I think, for students sometimes, but it's really important. And it has a lot of parallels with the US government and questions about central versus federal, or state versus federal authority and things like that. So in Mexico, let me just give you some of the context here. As soon as Mexico becomes independent in 1821, Mexico is trying really hard to figure out what kind of government structure it's going to have. And it's got two options, centralism or federalism, right? And centralism is what it sounds like. It's centralizing authority. Its most obvious example is a monarchy, right? But it's centralizing authority in some place like Mexico City, right? Federalism is the opposite. It's the states having authority and sharing that with the national government in sort of a power sharing. In many cases, the states have as much, if not more, authority in certain areas than the national government, right? These are the two kind of opposite, on the spectrum, they're on the opposite ends kind of thing. Mexico tries centralism in the very beginning, and it doesn't work very well. They have a brief flirtation with monarchy. And then they go and they write this constitution, the Constitution of 1824. And the hope, and I want to emphasize this, the deep hope of all Mexicans is that their new federal constitution and embracing federalism and giving the states a lot of rights and powers will ensure the prosperity of Mexico, that it will help them be stable, that it will bring an economic development, that it will produce good things. But that's the problem. Good things don't really come from Mexico for most of the 1820s. It becomes increasingly unstable politically within Mexico. They have one presidential election in 1824, Guadalupe Victoria. And then the next presidential election in 1828, the guy gets elected, gets overthrown. A guy named Pedraza gets overthrown by a guy named Guerrero. And then the military gets involved in politics, and it's just kind of a hot mess. And there's coups that become more frequent in the late 1820s. And by the early 1830s, there's coup after coup. It becomes very politically unstable. In the late 1820s, Spain invades and tries to take over. There's a crisis that comes with that. And all the while, Mexico is growing increasingly bankrupt, right? Things are not going well. And so I say all that to emphasize something that I think is important to understand about Mexico during this period, is that there's a lot of Mexicans who look around in the 1820s and say to themselves, this isn't going well. We need to do something different to stabilize things, to have a prosperous future. And so they start saying, maybe federalism isn't working so well. What if we go back towards centralism? And there's a growing group, particularly in Mexico City, that is increasingly worried that if they don't centralize authority in Mexico City, they are not going to be able to keep the country together. And they're not going to be able to solve all these major and very difficult problems facing Mexico, right? And Texas is one example of these kind of wayward provinces where things are possibly going off the rails. It's not the only one. Yucatan, constantly rebelling from Mexico City. Zacatecas is a very wealthy mining district that doesn't really like to listen to Mexico City either. There's a lot of problems at a lot of the edges. But that group in Mexico City of what are called centralists, who are moving towards centralizing authority, are increasingly trying to assert Mexico City's authority over these wayward provinces. Not because they're power-hungry, crazy people, although a lot of them do enjoy power, but it's because they're trying to save Mexico. That is the intention here, right? But that's also why they send to Texas in the late 1820s a general named Manuel de Mir y Terán. And I love talking about Terán. He's a wonderful character. He was a part of the Mexican Revolution. He's a Mexican general. He is a true patriot of Mexico. He really cares about the country. And they send him to Texas because of all the stuff we were talking about, because of the Fredonian Rebellion, because of all the migration of people moving in who are bringing slaves who aren't really supposed to be bringing slaves in. Mexico City is increasingly worried that maybe we're not in control of Texas. And so they send Terán to do a report on what's going on up there. Officially, Terán's job is to inspect the border with the United States. That's his cover. But what he's really supposed to do is spy on the colonies and then write a report back about what he finds. So he goes up there in 1828, does an inspection tour, hangs out with Stephen F. Austin. He goes to Jared Gross's plantation. He's all over the place. And he's very impressed by what he sees. If you read his report, he talks all about like, this place is so prosperous. The cotton production is amazing. They're bringing in all kinds of money. He notices how slavery is fundamentally important to the colonists. But what he's most alarmed by is just the sheer number of Americans. Like the colonization project has worked really well, too well, as far as Mexico City is concerned, because Terán looks around and sees that there's at least 10 Americans now in Texas for every Tejano, 10 to 1. And a lot of these guys don't seem to be paying a whole lot of attention to Mexican law. And Terán sees that if this trajectory continues, that Texas is going to be lost to Mexico. He just looks down the line and says, if this keeps going, there's no way we can hold Texas. So Terán writes a report. He saying all of that and making a very fundamental recommendation, which is that American immigration to Mexico should be cut off, and they should seal the border off from these Americans who are coming into Texas, right? He sends this letter down to Mexico City, where it gets in the hands of this guy, Lucas Alman, who was a really towering figure in early Mexican history. He's kind of like, there's no exact analogy. He's kind of like if Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were one person, that would be Lucas Alman for the early Mexican government. And he's the most powerful politician in Mexico City besides the president at the time. And when he gets this report, he's one of those guys that's been moving towards centralism. He's one of those guys that's worried Mexico's coming apart at the seams. And the way to save the country is to assert Mexico City's authority. So he marches this report down to the Mexican legislature and says, we've got to do something about this. And so in response, they do what Tehran had recommended. They outlaw American immigration to Texas with the law of April 6th, 1830, right? And I would say this is in many ways the big pivot toward the Texas Revolution, because this is where Mexico City is starting to reassert its authority over Texas. In ways that it had every right to do, but in ways that are going to cause conflict with the colonists, but also the Tejanos, that will help eventually lead to the Texas Revolution. So the law of April 6, 1830, and that's, it's very much in the teaks. It does a lot of things. The most famous one is it just says no more American immigration into Mexico, right? But that's not all that it does. And it's important that we explain to our students that the other things are just as powerful. One of the things that the law of April 6 does is it gives Mexico's president the right to establish new forts in Texas that are going to begin collecting taxes. Courtney said earlier, and she's absolutely right, that the settlers in Texas had were exempt from paying taxes for a certain amount of time. That was expiring right now in the early 1830s. So they just did not renew the exemption. And they said that they could start collecting these at these new forts. But the purpose of the new forts, of course, is to keep an eye on the Texans and to give Mexico City an ability to respond quickly if there's trouble in the region. The other thing that the law of April 6, 1830 did that we never talk about is that it mandated that the Americans stop importing enslaved people using that contract law, 356, that I was telling you guys about earlier. They're trying to shut down that movement of enslaved people that's still moving into Texas, all right? So what happens? You guys know the story, I think. Mexico City starts setting up forts, right? They set them up at Velasco at the mouth of the Brazos River. They set them up at the mouth of the Trinity in Galveston Bay at a place called Anahuac, right? They set up these forts there that are trying to tax the colonists. And what they're mostly taxing actually is cotton shipments, because that's what the colonists make money on. That's what's being shipped out. That's what's bringing goods in. So they set up these forts here. They put some federal troops in these forts. Do the Americans like this? Absolutely not. And so there gets to be some conflicts. What are commonly called the disturbances of 1832, right? There's 10 Texans killed and 5 Mexican soldiers killed at the fight at Velasco. There's a standoff at Anahuac where the commander, Juan Brayburn, is surrounded. And there's just, all these tensions look like they're leading directly toward the Texas Revolution. And what the Texans are pushing against is Mexico City's authority in this region. That's what they're pushing back against, centralizing of that authority in all these different ways. But they're not rebelling yet, and they don't want to rebel. I want to emphasize that. There is no serious talk in 1832 or 1833 or even 1834 of rebellion against the Mexican government, because all these colonists in Austin's colony, they have land, and the title to that land is assured to them by the Mexican government. And the Mexican government has been very good to them. It's given them an enormous amount of land and opportunity. It has put very few restrictions on them, and most of them are pretty grateful for most of that. Plus, if you rebel, there's a really good chance you lose and that everything will be taken away. So the Texans, they try to work within the system, and they try to assert their authority under the federal Constitution of 1824. And this is why this is important, because what they decide they really need to protect their rights is not to rebel from Mexico. It's to make Texas its own separate state within Mexico. What they really want is to detach themselves from Coahuila. And so they won't be Coahuila, Texas anymore. Coahuila will be its own state, and Texas will be its own state. Why does that matter? Because they are going to get to write their own constitution, right? They get to decide all kinds of issues for themselves, slavery, but everything else as well. Everything that they want to decide for themselves, they will be in charge of. And so what they really think is that the Constitution of 1824 will be their ultimate protection. So they hold a couple conventions in 1832 and 1833, proposing separate statehood and demanding the repeal of the law of April 6, 1830. And then they decide to take these protests down to Mexico City itself. They got to find somebody who is a smooth talker, who can hopefully make the case to people in Mexico City. They volunteer Stephen F. Austin to go do this. And so Austin, who's, I wouldn't say reluctant, but he's been down to Mexico City several times at this point, and it's a long journey for him. But the survival of his colonies and the success of them long term is really important. So Austin takes these protests, asking for separate statehood for Texas, and he takes them down to Mexico City. He once again travels all the way down, all right? And as he's going down there, he's feeling pretty confident that things are going to go well, because the president of Mexico at the time is a guy that Stephen F. Austin really likes. He's a guy who's known to be supportive of the federal Constitution of 1824, and therefore of the rights of the states under federalism. He's a guy who's actually the poster child for supporting states' rights within Mexico, and is probably going to be very receptive to the Texans. Santa Anna, who Stephen F. Austin was convinced was going to be exactly the right person to talk to this particular time. All right. So Austin gets to Mexico City. He actually doesn't get to meet with Santa Anna himself originally. He gets to meet with his vice president, Gomez Farias. But he meets with Santa Anna's representatives and eventually does talk to Santa Anna himself. And what Stephen F. Austin is proposing, he's like, hey, listen, well, we should be our own state. We have enough people in Texas now. We have overcome that. And when you guys originally tied us to Coahuila, you said, if we ever had enough people, we could be our own state. We think it's the time for that. We, the Anglos, want that. The Tejanos want that. We all want that. So please, can we be our own state under Mexico? And Santa Anna hears this and thinks about it for a second. And he says, yeah, no, can't do that, buddy. I'm so sorry, but can't make you your own state. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the main one is that what's going on in Mexico City? There's this move towards centralism, right? To centralize authority. Turning Texas loose to be its own state was just not in the cards right now in terms of political support within Mexico City, and Santa Anna could recognize that. And so Santa Anna says no to Stephen F. Austin. All right. Stephen F. Austin leaves, and he is heartbroken. He is just flabbergasted by this. So he goes back to his hotel, and he does a really dumb thing. All right. Has anybody here sent an angry text or an angry email that you later said, yeah, I should have done that while I was mad? I know I've done that more than once. Stephen F. Austin at this moment does the 19th century equivalent of that. He writes an angry letter. And what he does is he sends a letter to Texas reporting that the Santa Anna's government said, no, you can't be your own separate state. And Stephen F. Austin says, I know they said we shouldn't do it, but let's just go ahead and do it anyway. All right. He sends that up to San Antonio, to the Tejanos. It gets intercepted along the way and sent back down to Mexico City. His mail is read. It is sent back. It looks like he's saying to go against the national government. That is seen as treasonous behavior. And Stephen F. Austin, who by the time all this discovered, he's actually on his way back to Texas. He gets captured in Coahuila and then brought back down to Mexico City, where he is thrown in prison. All right. So you can imagine being back in Texas, hearing about all this stuff. Not only is Texas not going to be its own separate state, but now the most famous impresario, the most famous person in Texas, Stephen F. Austin, has been thrown into prison by Santa Anna's government. How will the Texans react to this? You imagine? And I love setting up these questions that my students can't possibly know the answer to. So let them speculate and think through this, because in these moments, they get to put their mind in the place of what someone in Texas might have been thinking in this moment. And that is some of the most critical things that we can do in the classroom is empathetic teaching, like getting them to think about someone else's perspective with the limited knowledge that a historical person would have had at the time. Not what we know now, but what they would have known then, right? That's, I think, one of the most powerful things we can do in our classrooms. And the students love it. At least my students really enjoy that. They'll come up with all kinds of reactions. But they're usually surprised to learn that the reaction in Texas to Stephen F. Austin being imprisoned was, yeah, that's sad for Steve. I hope he gets out soon. But I don't know. It's just, people were outraged that he was in jail. I don't want to underplay that. But they weren't suddenly moving to revolution or even outright rebellion against the government in any way, shape, or form. They're like, it's terrible, but things are actually going pretty well here in Texas. Because what was happening during the early 1830s, actually starting in 1831, is that there's a massive cotton boom. Cotton prices start going through the roof again. So again, it'd be like oil doubling or tripling in value all of a sudden. There's this 4 or 5 year run during the first half of the 1830s, between 1831 and 1835, when cotton prices just go through the absolute roof. And when that happens, that makes the land in Texas all the more valuable than it's ever been. And people start pouring in from the United States in bigger and bigger numbers, right? And so from 1831 to 1835, the American population of Texas explodes from 10,000 to 21,000 on the eve of the Texas Revolution. So look at that with me for a second. During the entire 1820s, about 10,000 Americans came into Texas. And then in the 5 years between 1830 and 1835, it more than doubles to 21,000. Why is that? It's the cotton boom, the massive cotton explosion that happens, right? And it's important because during that early 1830s, when Mexico City is trying to clamp down on Texas and trying to clamp down on American immigration and all that sort of stuff, is the exact same moment people are pouring across the border in bigger numbers than ever before, all right? That is a lot of the tension that helps lead ultimately to the Texas Revolution, right? But even within that, it's not enough. One of the key movements that pushes Texas toward revolution is that Mexico itself erupts into a civil war, all right? And this happens for all the things that we've been talking about because of these fights over federalism that are happening in Mexico and specifically in Mexico City, all right? Because by the mid-1830s, there are so many politicians and leaders in Mexico City who've decided that federalism has failed. And the only way to save Mexico is to centralize authority in Mexico City and then assert authority across the rest of the country from Mexico City. That there is a coup that happens in Mexico City that overthrows the federal constitution, all right? And Santa Anna is the leader of this, right? He's not the only guy. We usually pin this entirely on Santa Anna, and I am not like saying Santa Anna's a good guy. He is not. But he is the leader of a much broader movement. I want to emphasize that in Mexico City. And he is the guy who helps, or he and them overthrow federalism, right? And so they overthrow the Constitution of 1824, which means all the individual states within Mexico are suddenly no longer states. And they no longer have power and they no longer have influence, all right? This creates a civil war in Mexico between centralists who are either they're on Santa Anna's side in this and they think that's a good thing for the country to centralize authority, or the old federalists who want to restore the Constitution of 1824, right? That would be people like people in Yucatan. Yucatan had always been asserting its own authority, and they like their power as an individual state. They didn't want to give that up. People in Zacatecas who don't want to give up state authority and don't want to give power to Mexico City, or people in Texas who don't like the idea of centralizing authority and losing what little they possibly could have had if they could have become their own state. All right. So within Texas, that is what the real pivot is in 1835, the overthrow of federalism, more than anything else. All right. And that leads to not an immediate move for war in Texas. There's still deep divisions within the state. There's a war party that's becoming more powerful. And then there's a group called the Peace Party who is saying, maybe we don't need to fight immediately. Maybe we can find some sort of solution. Who's afraid of the violence and the destruction and the chaos that war can bring. All right. These two sides are arguing with each other, but things are moving toward the war party. And then finally, there's a kerfuffle that I'm sure you guys have heard of that happens on October 2nd, 1835 in Gonzales, when centralist troops allied with Santa Anna try to recover the cannon that they had lent years before to some of the colonists in Green DeWitt's colony in Gonzales, Texas. The colonists refuse to give it back. They make a flag because why not? Hey, there's a little skirmish. The Texans keep the flag, they keep the flag, but they keep the cannon. And then suddenly, whether Texans wanted it or not, there was a war. And the Battle of Gonzales really forces a shift amongst many Texans to take the side of federalism officially in this civil war that's been raging across Mexico that gives birth to the Texas Revolution itself. So with that, I'm going to stop and then hand over the mic one last time to Courtney, who has a final set of resources for you guys.
All right, share. Okay, this last set of resources, there's 3 materials, but the last one is a quick activity that you can use across pretty much any topic that I really, really like. So there's an activity on the Mireille-Tehran report, the arrest of Stephen F. Austin, and then a mind mapping review activity. So jumping into Mireille-Tehran. So here, a similar setup to things we have done before, where you have a fairly long excerpt of a primary source, and then the translations that go with it. This is from Mireille-Tehran's report, where he is reporting back about all the problems that he's noticed in Texas. The first one talks about, like Andrew said, how the Tejanos are outnumbered 10-1. The second one is talking about how there are very few civil authorities, Mexican civil authorities in Texas, and the ones who are there are useless. He says there's neither civil authorities except one insignificant little man who doesn't convene but once in a lifetime. I love that. The third one is talking about how just Americans are pouring in, and they don't like those slavery laws, and they've been working to get rid of them, which they had. It says they've already succeeded in getting the Congress to recognize, to make a law recognizing contracts. So it refers back to that. Number 4 is talking about how there's some bad blood between some of the Tejanos and the foreigners, but even in cases where he's saying people don't get along, the one thing that they all agree on is that Texas should be separate from Coahuila. And the 5th one is basically saying all of this is just a hot mess. At any point, it could be ready for war. There are good people here, but there's also crazy bad people here. And all of them, he says, keep their constitution in their pocket and they demand the privileges which it guarantees. So the 1 through 5 are Mireille-Tehran's excerpts. And then the letters are the translations. And we've done that before, so they would match them up. And then the work that goes with it is also what we've done before. You find the excerpt number, you write what the translation letter is that should go with it, and then you write a 5-word or whatever word summary. And then there's some on the advanced material, there's some questions that go with it, a couple of multiple choice, but mostly short answer. The other 2 materials are similar, but less and less writing. So same setup here. The grade level assignment has more multiple choice than a short answer. And then the foundations level is entirely multiple choice with this 1 short answer at the end, providing a sentence stem. And that very last one gives them an opportunity to kind of not just regurgitate information, but what do you think these Mexico would think about these problems? Which problem do you think Mexico would think is worse? That kind of thing. The second material is it's not a primary source document by itself, but it's primary sources dropped into a context that presents the information about the arrest of Stephen F. Austin. So it sets up the background. Anything in bold is primary source. So it sets up the background for, why Stephen F. Austin is heading toward Mexico City. It is talking about how he's, been in negotiations with the combined government, trying to, talk things through about the issues of slavery and everything. And it also says that he went down to Mexico, or he's in Mexico. He went down to Mexico City to have this meeting, and then he writes this letter. And the primary source document is a letter that the Secretary of State of Coahuila, Texas, sent to order the arrest of Stephen F. Austin. And he's basically saying, like, we found this letter. It's full of subversive ideas, promoting a scandalous revolution, and all of this stuff. So Austin's arrested. The next primary source here is from Austin's own diary that he kept while he was in jail, talking about how horrible this was. He's not a criminal. He's been ensnared, like his intentions were pure and correct. The next one introduces a letter written from an American man in Brazoria, Texas, who was an Austin supporter, and kind of going back to what Andrew said, like, he's upset about it. He's talking about, like, oh, this is nonsense. Like, it's what they say that he did is just falsehood. It's misrepresentation. But at the very end, he says, there's no grounds for this charge, and the delay and vexation of the journey will be the worst consequence. Like, he doesn't expect anything to come out of this. And there's some more there that he says about other things he feels about this letter. So the work that they're doing is looking at these three different points of view. So there's the Secretary of State, J. Miguel Falcon, there's Stephen F. Austin, and there's an unnamed, because in the letter it doesn't say, an unnamed resident of Brazoria. So for the advanced work, they're trying to figure out what's that person's point of view, and then use evidence from their writings to support why they're saying that's their point of view, and then answer some open-ended questions about that material. For the grade level, same idea. This gives them a little extra support, telling them where to look to find the evidence to support their claim. And there's only one short answer question. And then in the foundations level, that summary here, because each one of them would be writing a quick summary off to the side, 3, 5 words, whatever. The summary here, they're given 2 options and they choose the best one for what is the best summary for this excerpt. And then at the very end, they're given the person's point of view, and they're trying to decide which of these statements from their writings supports that point of view. The very last thing is a mind map. You can do this with any topic. I have included a template so that you can just use it for any topic, any unit, anything. And it's really, really excellent for reviewing tons of information. And essentially, there's probably different things you can call this. I learned it as a mind map, where you have the main topic here, and then you're just connecting ideas. And when I've used this in class, I've gotten a pretty good response, as good as you can get from 12-year-olds, about like, wow, like they kind of saw how things fit together better. So basically what I do is, I do this, I had tables. I would do this in a group, you'd get butcher paper, but if you don't have tables, you can do a couple students working together around a desk. You could put big paper up on the wall and they could write with markers on the wall. But I kind of talk about, they should already know this, but how a mind map works. And then I give them in steps what I want them to add on their mind map. I always start with a slide that's like 4 things. One of them is our big topic, 3 are subtopics within it, and see if they can figure out, and if they're paying any kind of attention. The impresario system. What's our main topic? And here's the impresario system, but sometimes they don't make those connections. So the impresario system would be in the middle here, and then they would use reasons for immigration in a circle out here, requirements out here, problems in Texas out here. And I tell them that there's a lot of leeway with how they put their mind map together. If they think at some point there needs to be something else connected to the impresario system, they can do that. So after they have that, and that, we kind of go over like, what was the main topic? What are the 3 subtopics? Awesome. Each slide after that has 6 new things to add. And I don't tell them where to put these things. And I do tell them that there's probably, in a lot of cases, more than one place where these things fit. For advanced classes, I might say, okay, you have 3 minutes. I'll read through the things: convert to Catholicism, increase population, Mexican government, Comanche raids, plantation agriculture, panic of 1819. Figure out where they go. I give them 3 minutes. I kind of walk around. They'll have questions. Do your best. And then at the end of those 3 minutes, I ask, like, where do you share where you put some of these things? And remember, there's more than one right place. So if they put convert Catholicism into requirements, I would ask them why. Well, because that was one of the requirements for being an impresario in Texas. And in this first slide, I always try and make it things that pretty obviously have specific places to go. And then I get more vague with the things that I put in. So they have to really think through, where would we put this and why? So I give them 3, 4, 5 minutes per slide. Each student has a marker. If there's a student who's like foundations level and they're really not supposed to write a whole lot, have them doing input, but make them like a timekeeper. I'll put the clock up on the board, running down 3 minutes, counting down, and they're the ones who are supposed to keep their group on time. And it really gets a lot of good discussions out of students, because a kid will start writing Fredonian Rebellion somewhere and someone else will be like, no, it doesn't go there. And then they'll like, well, yeah, it does, because whatever. And surprisingly, they get into it for the most part. Maybe not surprisingly, because they like to argue at 12 years old. But it really only takes a few slides. Like I put 6 slides here for this, getting a little bit more specific each time, getting a little bit more vague each time. For advanced students, I could even say, like, if you finished putting your 6 things into your mind map, add more. Like, tell me a little bit more about it, or can you think of anything else that connects to that? And this just really, really works excellent every single time. And you can take the template that I have included here, where it just like, choice 1, choice 2, choice 3, choice 1, whatever. You can take that and use that for any unit. And it really, really gets the students thinking about how all of these things fit together. And with that, I'll turn it back over.
Wonderful. Well, we've approached the end of our webinar series, and I just really want to thank Andrew and Courtney for an amazing week of learning. Y'all both presented such amazing information, resources for the group, and I'm confident that everyone is leaving these sessions with both ideas and inspiration. So thank you. Thanks teachers again for taking time out of your summers for this and for your engagement and participation this week. Like I said, I know you all gained something to take back to your classrooms, ideas, resources, lessons. And I'm really excited about how this week went.